Hello and welcome to Rotted Reviews, and today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. Instead of having individual reviews for all the Rotted requesters, I'm doing one big video with all 4 of their requests for the month of February. If you like this video and you like the channel and you've been digging the content, I implore you to please click subscribe, share the content, and if you want to support me further, my Patreon link is below. We have watch parties, we have Discord benefits, there's exclusive behind the scenes stuff, there's weekly vlogs, and the lowest tier starts at $1 a month. How much better could it get? Now, one thing that was a bit of a surprise, and honestly a very pleasant one, was the request for the requesters. When I put it out there, I put out a form for them to fill out, and it just, title of the movie, year, why you want to pick this one, so on and so forth. But the point is, they can't see each other's selection. So it turned out to be a bit of a wonderful little surprise when I noticed that all 4 entries that were picked were very much of the female perspective, female point of view, female narrative, female protagonist, so on and so forth. And I am all about that. I thought that was just a wonderful little coincidence to pop up there and makes for a nice little hook for this video, so here we go. Alright, since this is going to be a bit of a long video, let's just go ahead and get right to it. The first entry is selected by patron Catherine, who asked me to take a look at the 2021 movie, The Manor. Written and directed by Axel Carolyn, this movie follows the character of Judith, played by 𝗘𝗾𝗺𝗺 𝗠. And Judith is a person that, well, she's getting a little bit up there in years, and she's starting to have some medical problems. She used to be a dancer, and she has a vibrant lifestyle involving her family and so forth, but unfortunately she suffers a stroke and is forced to reconcile the needs and wants of herself and her family versus needing to be taken care of at a professional facility. And once she gets there and gets settled in, she starts to realize just how much autonomy has been stripped away from her, and then starts experiencing some odd events, which becomes a bit of a focal point in terms of character conflict, because between her condition and that level of autonomy being stripped away from her, nobody believes Judith.
Were you in my room last night?
In your room?
Around 1 a.m. What kind of creep watches women when they sleep? And Annette's crucifix is missing. Is that what you do, steal from the elderly?
Judith, tea's getting cold.
So it's pretty much up to her and her alone to uncover the mystery of what's going on at this care facility, as well as try to find a way to kind of settle into this new life and ingratiate herself amongst the other residents. I found this to be a fairly interesting movie that does a good job at touching on some pretty natural fears. A lot of us have fear of growing older and losing our ability to kind of advocate for ourselves, as well as the possibility of actually having mental deterioration and decline. I mean, let's face it, that's some pretty scary shit. So it kind of stands to reason that we would have some horror movies that would not necessarily capitalize on that fear, but, use it as an element of the plot device. The thing about The Manor is it kind of feels a bit superficially linear. It feels like a made-for-TV movie. It doesn't touch on some terribly complicated points, but the storyline itself moves forward in a very kind of, predictable fashion, until it doesn't. I think the whole thing about how Judith isn't being believed when she's experiencing these kind of things and uncovering the mysteries, and how she's kind of stymied and cut off at the ankles every single chance she gets, it just feels a little bit done to death, in all honesty. But what kept me interested in this were the pretty dynamic performances by some of the other residents, most notably Bruce Davison as Roland, Jill Larson as Trish, and Fran Bennett as Ruth. Those 3 proved to be a fairly dynamic presence that were kind of the more vibrant aspect of this care facility that took Judith under her wing. And also, I have to give some pretty major nods to 𝗘𝗾𝗺𝗺 𝗠. I've honestly been a big fan of hers since the 1993 movie Splitting Hairs, which is kind of one of those under-the-radar comedies that you never really hear anybody talk about, but it starred Eric Idle, Rick Moranis, John Cleese, and, of course, 𝗘𝗾𝗺𝗺. Not the greatest of comedies, but worth talking about more than Not at All, which is about the level of discourse it's had in the last 30 years. I couldn't help but draw some parallels between The Manor and the recent film Relic, because both kind of touch on those elements of fear of growing old, of losing our mental faculties, so on and so forth. And I have to say that although The Manor provided the more easy to follow linear storyline on a fairly, beat by beat level, which was entertaining and enjoyable, I would have to say that Relic actually touched on those fears a whole lot better. It was more subversive about it, and it tackled it in a way that kind of blindsided you, and it dealt with it on a subtextual level that made the top level scares really punch in the gut. But stepping away from that comparison, I do have to admit that the Manor did one thing that I didn't expect, which kind of seems a little bit defeating, and that is surprise me. I didn't expect it to surprise me, and I certainly didn't expect the methodology in which it would do it. It kind of wound up in a place where you have a fork in the road, and the most logical path is not necessarily the one you want to take, but it's kind of the one that you would expect to take based on the nature of what we've seen in the film all the way up until that point. That kind of beat for beat, almost somewhat predictable but entertaining storyline of that kind of made-for-TV movie. You would think that that fork in the road would be met with that same level of superficial ideal, but no, instead, it definitely takes a hard left turn into unpredictable territory, and I loved that aspect. Which is why I said earlier that it was fairly predictable until it wasn't. And that was one of the reasons that I honestly think that the Manor kind of got elevated for me in terms of the score. The core plot line, the technical and the acting scores and so forth get kind of medium of the road, 13 to 16, but I did feel like by having something that was entertaining and yet still kept me on my toes, I'm happy to give the intense score 17 points. Not great, but better than I thought. It's also worth mentioning just on a personal level, it doesn't affect the score, but even so, as an aside, I appreciate the really wicked Abbott and Costello references in this film. I'm always going to give that a special smile. So thank you, Catherine, for recommending The Manor. If you haven't seen it yet, I do recommend it. It would be a good one for just kind of a entertaining Friday night, not necessarily a turn your brain off kind of movie, but, if you're not in the mood for anything, elevated horror that's dripping with subtext and so forth, and you just want something that is a pleasant little horror movie to watch, yeah, I thought it was decent. And the next movie on our list is picked out by Jackie, who asked me to take a look at the 2016 movie, The Love Witch. And the reason that she picked this one is because 'tis the season for love. Sure enough, and unfortunately I did get to this a little bit later than Valentine's Day, and I apologize for that. February has absolutely been a dumpster fire of bullshit f***ery that I just never want to deal with ever again. Written and directed by Anna Biller, this movie stars Samantha Robinson as Elaine, the Love Witch. Elaine has a bit of a predicament. She just can't seem to find love no matter how hard she looks. She seems to enrapture the attention of every man that she comes across, which is kind of compounded by her dabbling into love spells, but it never seems to work out. The men always seem to leave her, however you might want to interpret that term. Now here's the thing about The Love Witch. I had never really heard of this movie before. I'd certainly never seen any clips of it. So when I sat down to watch it, in the first 2 minutes of it, I was absolutely hooked. This film has such a unique aesthetic to it that it was a wonderful little callback to the 1960s, not necessarily sexploitation films, but just the classic films of the 60s and even 70s. One thing that I thought as I was watching her drive with 35mm film stock and vibrant colors up against a reverse projection kind of thing down the Pacific Coast Highway was how much it reminded me just aesthetically of some of the classic Disney films like Blackbeard's Ghost. I don't think I've seen a modern movie so perfectly capture that aesthetic and that vintage style with just having the most perfect technical dynamics to it. Every setting, every character, every scene has a different mood and a different color palette based on that mood. I did enjoy the storyline, and I mean thoroughly, but I also have to admit that as much as I enjoyed it, it really took a back seat to the visual spectacle that I was witnessing. This is definitely not going to be for everybody. Although the visuals captured my heart, that doesn't mean it's going to for everybody out there. It is a very unique aesthetic. Not to mention, even if you do love the aesthetic, that doesn't necessarily mean that the storyline or characters are going to work for you. It did for me. I love the character of Elaine, and Samantha Robinson played her so well. The voiceover of it worked just wonderfully, and it provided a really kind of interesting insight into the character, because not only were we getting a voiceover, we were getting that voiceover from her perspective. So however she viewed the world, skewed as that might be, is how it was relayed to us, which was a really fun little thing to play with. I really don't think that that I can praise or recommend this movie enough, and I'm really thankful to Jackie for recommending it. I do want to put out a bit of a different recommendation for it, though. If you do watch this, which I do recommend, and you enjoy it, and you have a Shudder subscription, I also recommend doing what I did, which is after you finish watching the movie, go back and watch it a second time, but this time, watch the version that's on Shudder with The Last Drive-In with 𝗘𝗶𝗽𝗺𝗺. He does some wonderful behind-the-scenes secrets of the filming style, as well as points out a lot of its influences, and even does an interview with Anna Biller, the writer-director.
It's just the video image to me is, for my own taste, doesn't feel dimensional. It feels very flat.
Which was a fantastic and wonderful interview and really kind of relayed just how much care and craftsmanship went into this film. The third movie on our list of 4 comes to us from patron Ben, who asked me to take a look at the 2021 movie Censor. And according to Ben, he picked this one out because it is a retro tech horror that blends many elements that I loved. In fact, it made my top 10 of 2021 list. Well, thank you, Ben. I have to admit that it didn't make my top 10 of 2021, but that's largely because I didn't watch it back in 2020. This one has been on my list to watch for a while, and for some reason, I just never pulled the trigger on it. I was very inclined to when I saw that it made a lot of people's top 10 of 2021, but it wasn't until just recently, based on this request, that I went ahead and finally pressed play. I mean, hell, sometimes you just get bogged down with the next Amityville movie or Terror at Bigfoot Pond. You just kind of miss out on the good ones sometimes. Written and directed by Prano Bailey Bond, this movie is kind of centered around the British committee that was formed to determine whether or not something could be passed as a horror film or whether it needed to be banned as a video nasty. And within this committee, we find our main character of Enid Barnes, played by Niamh Algar, who is an individual that is able to view these things without being affected by them. Nothing really gets to her. She's able to see these things objectively and then discuss how much of this decapitation should be shown, how much of it shouldn't, and whether or not that crosses the line to get it banned entirely. Unfortunately, Enid isn't quite as stable as she would like to appear when she has to evaluate a videotape that brings to surface some childhood trauma, most notably mirroring the circumstances in which she lost her sister. I thought that this was a really fantastic example of kind of the hypocrisy that surrounded the events that led to the video nasty bannings. It kind of that presupposition of we're going to watch this and be unaffected by it to protect you from watching it because you'll be affected by it. It just doesn't make sense, and it certainly didn't at that time. So to kind of take a movie and turn it on its head by having a character watch it and potentially, yes, be affected by it was a phenomenal little layer of storytelling. I've watched my fair share and even reviewed my fair share of video nasties, but I'm by no means an expert on it. There are some fantastic channels devoted to that. Me, I'm a little bit more of a meat and potatoes, take any horror that comes across my way, including the video nasties kind of guy. So I've never really dove into the topic with an academic level of research, just kind of on the level of a movie fan watching stuff that used to be banned. I think that Censor worked for me most notably because of the Enid character on 2 levels. First of all, the performance that was put out by Niamh Algar was fantastic. She portrayed this character in a way that was very sympathetic, yet kind of not really understanding exactly where they're coming from, not always knowing what next decision they're going to make, and it kept the audience on its toes pretty darned well. And beyond the performance, just on the narrative sense, it was brilliantly written. The notion of the unreliable narrator shone brightly in this film. Is Enid losing her mind? Is there a malevolent or malicious force at work here by presenting her with this tape that mirrors her background so well? Or are these video nasties that she's forced to view day in and day out actually corrupting her in the way that they told us would happen if we watched too many of them? The slow decline of the character as she's going down this path of trying to find answers behind who's behind this tape, what were their intentions, do they know me, do they not, do they know my sister, do they not, is she alive, is she not? All these questions that she starts to try and answer, all at the expense of the almost degradation of her mental and emotional state, was just a fascinating thing to watch. And a lot of it was helped by the technical aspects of this film. The notion of when she's starting to really go down the rabbit hole and some of the climactic elements are starting to surface, that the actual aspect ratio of the film very slowly changes to kind of bring the audience into her state of mind as it's fracturing in front of her eyes. I just thought that was brilliant, as I thought the entire movie was brilliant. So thank thank you, Ben, for recommending Censor to me. I fully recommend it to all of you out there. If you haven't seen it yet, if you are like me and you were one of the unwise ones that kept passing it over, please do yourself a favor and press play on it. And the last movie on our list comes to us from patron Shifty, who asked me to take a look at the 2021 film Seance. And his reasoning why is, he says, I don't think I've seen anyone really talking about this one. All right, so cards on the table. I did hear people talking about this when it was released, but not before I had seen it. That's right, I actually saw this one pretty darn close to its release date when it came out. It was only because of scheduling conflicts that it didn't turn into a rotted review, so I'm happy to tackle it this time around. And here's the thing, is when I did hear people talk about this one, it was fairly largely negative, and my thoughts on it were I didn't really see where that was coming from. Written and directed by Simon Barrett, this movie takes place at an all-girls academy that has some really high standards for its academic values. Unfortunately, bullying, cliques, and pranks are abound as the movie opens up by showing one of the students mysteriously dying. Enter the new girl, Camille Meadows, brought over from Florida to fill the vacant spot, played by Suki Waterhouse. Camille has to find her own way navigating the halls of this new place while overcoming a great deal of obstacles. The aforementioned bullying, not to mention the high academic standards, means that she has to play a lot of catch-up in her studies. All of this is compounded by some potentially supernatural events that are happening to her and her classmates. And to get to the bottom of all of this and try to find out who's haunting who and why, they hold themselves a seance. And then things get really out of hand. Look, Seance as a film, I don't think was anything that special. I think it's going to be one of those things that gets a little bit lost to the annals of time. It's going to be something that people stop talking about eventually. Like Shifty said, he didn't even see anybody talking about it in the first place, which I do think is a bit of a shame. This wasn't anything spectacular, but I think that that's only because this tries to wear a bit too many hats. This is kind of presented as part slasher, part supernatural, part revenge, part bullying, the human horror aspect of things. And I think it kind of is a situation of the film equivalent to the term jack of all trades, master of none. How it's presented as a supernatural film doesn't really get fleshed out that well. How it's presented as a slasher, again, I don't really think gets fleshed out that well. But on the whole, I do think that this was a very adept and interesting movie that did offer some surprises. I think one of the elements of this film that kind of worked against it was the pacing. There were some really drawn out moments that was trying to deliver tension, but just drew things out to such a degree that the scene itself just became boring, and then the big reveal of a jump scare or anything that may even be approaching that was just kind of met with, well, at least the scene's over now. And if I'm sounding overly harsh about this movie, I really don't mean to. I think it's kind of one of those films that's easy to over-hate. You know, just talking about it on a beat-by-beat, breakdown-by-breakdown, scene-by-scene level, yeah, there's a lot about Seance that doesn't really work, but when taken as a whole, I still found this to be a very enjoyable movie that offered enough surprises to continually keep me on my toes. Moreover, some of those surprise elements made this movie tread new ground. There were parts of this that I had never seen any horror movie ever even try before, which I thought was pretty cool. And to slip into my horror fan comfy shoes, I also have to admit that some of the attacks and kills and so on and so forth that happened in this movie were pretty freaking awesome. So I'm glad that Shifty recommended Seance, especially if you hadn't heard a whole lot about it, because I'm happy to talk about it. This is a movie that I may not love, but damn, I sure did like it a whole lot. So thank you, Shifty, for recommending this one, and thank you out there for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, again, please click like and subscribe. It really helps me out a lot. And again, if you want to support me further, my Patreon link is below. Remember, next time you want to watch a horror movie, first make sure that it's good and rotted.